Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm Jacob Levy. I'm the coordinator of the research group on constitutional studies, a unit of the Jan P. Lin Centre for the Study of Freedom and Global Orders in the Ancient and Modern Worlds. RGCS brings together scholars from across law, political science, political theory, and political philosophy who have shared and overlapping interests in studying the values, institutions, fundamental norms, and history of the grounding of political societies and political orders. It encompasses members of the university at all levels, including a substantial faculty and postdoctoral contingent from across law, political science, and philosophy, including a fellowship of PhD students, and including the RGCS Charles Taylor Student Fellows, who are undergraduate and master's students who meet in a weekly reading group through the year, except when they come to these events. The RGCS Lecture Series invites leading scholars to come present their research on the values, institutions, and principles of a free society in a way that is broadly accessible to the advanced student audience who make up a substantial proportion of the membership of RGCS. The lecture series has existed not as long as the rest of RGCS has. It is now supported in part by a generous grant from the Institute for Liberal Studies, but has been an important part of the addition to our programming, aiming to overcome traditional divisions between the presentation of ideas in ways that are accessible to other researchers and the presentation of much more popularized and less intellectually ambitious ideas, typically from people who are not themselves leading scholars, to an undergraduate audience that is considered not up to the task of hearing real work. We've built the lecture series around the idea both that leading researchers are often also outstanding teachers, and they can be asked to come put on their persona as an excellent teacher of their own research, and that students are capable of grasping and engaging with much more ambitious material than that division badly assumes that they are. This is the first event in this year's RGCS Lecture Series. In my announcements at the close, I will talk about upcoming events as well as having some other administrative announcements. But for now, I want to welcome the first lecture of this year, to extend an overdue welcome to David Schmidtz. David Schmidtz is one of the leading political and moral philosophers of his generation, with wide-ranging interests and scholarship that range from business ethics to environmental ethics to the foundations of social contract theory to inquiries about moral agency. He is also a tremendously influential teacher, advisor, and institution builder. He's a native of Humboldt, Saskatchewan. He got his BA from the University of Saskatchewan before moving on to subsequent training in both philosophy and economics at the University of Arizona. After stints as a professor at both Yale and Bowling Green State University, he returned to Arizona, where he has been for most of his career until recently decamping to West Virginia University. In his capacity at the University of Arizona, he rejuvenated and restored a program that, under the leadership of Joel Feinberg and a previous generation, had been one of the world's leading locales for political and legal philosophy, but was at real risk of losing that standing. And he built it into what was widely recognized as, for a period of over a decade, the leading Anglophone political philosophy program in the world. Among his students at the University of Arizona were one of the very first speakers in the RGCS Lecture Series, Matt Zwolinski, and one of the very first postdoctoral fellows at RGCS, Daniel Silverman. This is a welcome back to Professor Schmidtz. He has visited us briefly once before for a roundtable discussion on politics, philosophy, and economics. It was held in Ferrier one summer. but it is his first time at one of our major public events. That conversation about PPE, about politics, philosophy, and economics, points at some of the important things about David Schmidtz as a researcher and scholar. I mentioned that he was trained in philosophy and economics, and this at a time long before PPE had become a kind of vogue-ish interdisciplinary program on this side of the Atlantic. His first two major works, The Limits of Government, an essay on the public goods argument, and Rational Choice and Moral Agency, are deeply technically accomplished in the idioms and methods of both of those disciplines. Doing very different kinds of work, Rational Choice and Moral Agency being an examination about what it is like as a person to try to choose whether and when to be rational and to be moral and the connection between those choices. And The Limits of Government being a technical engagement with and reconstruction and critique of elements in social contract theory, in public goods, and public finance theory that amounts to one of the most significantly original accounts of Lockean contractarianism to emerge, I think, over the course of the 20th century. His subsequent work after those two showed a breadth of methodological styles as well, culminating in my favorite of his works, The Elements of Justice, a pluralistic and humanistic account of how to think about justice as a way to help us lead our lives that draws on but goes significantly beyond the technical accomplishments earlier in his career. And most recently, Living Together, The Invention of Moral Science, a copy of which will be given away to a student here today. David Schmidtz has helped to lead the integration of political philosophy with not only legal and moral philosophy, but with choice theory, decision theory, formal analysis, economics, and helps to overcome gaps between the strictly technical aspects of political philosophy and its applied neighbors in business ethics, the philosophy of economics, and environmental philosophy and environmental ethics. It's a real honor and privilege to be able to introduce and welcome David Schmidtz.
Thank you. Thank you for coming out this afternoon, and thank you, Jacob, for having me here. This is one of my favorite cities in the world, and Jacob is one of my favorite people in the world. So it's just a pleasure to be here. Okay, so these are topics I'll spend a little time on. Self-governance is about making decisions. It's how to live, how to understand, articulate, and pursue a mission, how to really mean it, and when to change it. In economics, a well-defined decision is a task of maximizing utility with respect to a budget constraint. And that's simple in theory. You can draw it on a blackboard, but in practice, our world doesn't give us substantial enough constraints to make our decision problems well-defined. Our normal human reality is we make somewhat arbitrary decisions about how to partition our life into episodes. So when we operate under a particular budget constraint, typically that will be downstream from having decided to operate under it. And even more interesting, that prior task of choosing budgets is not itself a rational choice problem. Rather, it's our way of building a framework by reference to which subsequent decision problems can become well-defined. So if I seek lodging, I don't infer from my life expectancy of 20 years that I only have 20 years to find a place. And I don't treat my net worth as the limit of how much I can spend on lodging. Constraints like that are what we get from the world. What comes from the world frequently isn't constraining enough to be what humanly rational choice needs. So humanly rational choice is choice within a context of having other things to do. It's choice within a compartment that we choose to regard as an episode in our lives as decision makers. My time budget is not my life expectancy, but considerations such as, well, where I want to be Monday morning on the first day of my new job. To be constrained only by the world, that's going to look like mental illness at some point. So if my night at the casino were constrained by my net worth plus my borrowing power, that would make me a gambling addict rather than a person setting up for a rational choice. Because we don't want to burn through our life savings in one night, we impose a limit, a spending allowance for that night. Life doesn't decide that I can't spend next month's rent at the casino tonight. I decide that. Gambling addicts can talk themselves out of their chosen budget, but humanly rational choice is partly about not creating decision-making nodes where decision-making nodes should not be. I already drew a line. I decided what needed deciding. Treating myself as having another decision to make now would imply a loss of self-control. But budgets and budget constraints aren't the only limitation, aren't the only thing that gives us a framework for decisions. Another limit is a search can come to an end not because we hit the limit of our budget, but because we found what we were looking for and thus have no reason to keep looking. So if I say, I'm working on a project, I need a screwdriver. When I turn up a screwdriver, two things can happen. If I'm optimizing, I can say, is this the best screwdriver I can find within the limits of the time I set aside for looking for a screwdriver? Alternatively, by contrast, I find that screwdriver and I could say, will this do? If the answer is yes, I stop looking. So having a clear enough picture of our target, that can help us understand that we've hit it, and that's when the project of hitting it comes to a close for that reason. So I could try to translate the satisficing question into an optimizing question in order to have a picture that looks like my rational choice theory. There isn't much of a rational choice theory for satisficing. It's under-theorized. But, the only reason to do that is if I'm trying too hard to be a theorist. So in practice, I don't delude myself that satisficing needs translating into the vocabulary of optimizing so that I can count it as rational. No purpose would be served. We create compartments, spaces for making particular decisions within particular constraints where life isn't constraining enough to give us a handle on how life has a way of coming at us in a series of episodes. So part of the challenge any given day is to bring this episode to a close so I can get on with the next one. The details often are somewhat arbitrary because what's not arbitrary is that we need self-imposed limits that leave us room to get on with other things. Challenges of corporate self-governance are a bit like challenges of individual self-governance. The world imposes limits on us, and still, that leaves us with decisions to make. We decide whether to take on debt. We decide whether to defer maintenance. We decide how to handle cash flow challenges. And at some point, we realized that we were taught all about profit, like profit is revenue minus cost. That doesn't matter. That's not an important business. What's really important is cash flow. Profit doesn't tell you whether you're going to be able to cover payroll at the end of October. It's cash flow that tells you that. Cash flow is everything. Profit, it's a theory. It's a theoretical construct. Cash flow is real. So when we can nicely define a corporate mission, but picking a corporate mission will still be picking. rather than a well-defined rational choice problem. Within parameters, many possible targets will make sense, but we don't get a mission by calculating. We get a mission by picking. Individuals face something like a principal-agent problem. Insofar as individual agents decide how to practice the self-restraint that's at the heart of individual sanity. Now, somebody define a principal-agent problem for me. Who knows? Who's been taught what a principal-agent problem and can just give me a quick definition of that? What's a principal-agent problem? You heard me, right? What's a principal-agent problem? I'll start at the back, or maybe you can bail me out. What's a principal-agent problem? Nada? What would you say a principal-agent problem is?
I think you would be better to answer that.
Okay, so seriously, no, you don't know what a principal-agent problem is. Like, really? Okay, well, sorry, I'm starting too far ahead. Then, you can help me though.
I hope so. If you have a principal-agent problem, if you've entrusted somebody to act on your behalf.
Oh, that's good. Excellent. Perfect. Okay, so in a commercial society, we have relationships. And we have relationships between people providing services and people paying for and receiving the services. A principal is someone who pays for a service or to whom a service is due. An agent is an agent of the principal providing the service. Okay, so individuals decide how to practice the self-restraint that's at the heart of individual sanity. I said the person you are, and partly, like, think about the casino. The person you are this evening at the casino has to decide what kind of life to leave for the person you will wake up as tomorrow. So does that make sense to think of you can be a principal and you can be the agent as well, trying to decide, is this really what I want to eat tonight or drink tonight or what I want to spend tonight? What am I going to feel like when I wake up tomorrow morning? And am I going to think, well, that was smart? Or am I going to think, I've got to learn how to say no. I've got to learn. Yeah, so you can be an agent. You can be your own agent. Whether it makes sense to look at it that way, well, it depends on whether anything is illuminated. However, managing principal-agent problems is clearly part of collective self-governance. A corporation needs to know itself, including that it consists of individual decision makers who may not buy into its corporate mission without reservation. So what set of incentives and opportunities and exercises in moral education would channel the behavior of individual agents, employees, and so on, in ways that serve the corporate mission? How does crafting a mission statement serve a corporate mission? It's a thing, like PPE is a thing. Why is it a thing? What made it a thing? And what will happen? Will it still be a thing tomorrow? Well, who knows? A business needs to decide, though, how to make dealing with it safe for customers, for staff. And a state, likewise, needs to decide how to make its citizens safe from other people, including those other people who, for reasons of their own, decide to do whatever it takes in a competition for public office. So there's a public choice school of political economy that ostensibly has this cynical view. How many people have heard of the public choice school? A few. Okay, well, I'm going to ask you guys to define principal-agent problem. Okay, never mind. Say this public choice school ostensibly has this very cynical view of politicians as government employees, as creatures driven by self-interest, people just in it for themselves. To me, that's not it. Public choice's insight, the deeper, the important, and the simple insight is not that politicians are selfish maximizers, but that politicians are agents who have decisions to make and who have things to do. So failing to heed this insight, where does that lead you? Well, academics theorize about what governance structures ought to do, but fundamental fact, governance structures aren't decision makers. They're arenas of decision making. So asking what governance structure should do is that's like asking what apples should do. It's not the right question. Within these arenas of decision making, results emerge from contests among individual decision makers who may or may not agree on what a government's mission should be. But even if they agree, they've still got a problem because they've got different views on how to serve that mission. So of course, a final score will emerge, but it won't be a final score that one of the players chose as the final score. Final scores don't come about that way. They come about as a result of the contest between the players. Politics is like that. A corporate agent survives by generating positive cash flow, but a corporation needs more of a plan than that. Like, make a profit. That's not a real plan. Have positive cash flow, sustain positive cash flow. That's not a real plan. A corporation needs to decide how it's going to make money. It needs to know, much like any individual social animal needs to know, how it intends to be of service. A purpose is a compass. It orients us toward acting in one way rather than another. Corporations need a compass, I think, pretty much the same way that individual agents do. The point isn't, I'm not trying to get to a conclusion about what a corporation's particular purpose should be. That's not the point. The point is for a corporation is to exhibit purposiveness per se. We pick a purpose partly for the sake of being purposive. And that too is not a well-defined problem. It's more like picking a frame of reference that can make subsequent problems well-defined, much like choosing constraints with respect to which optima become definable. A state likewise needs to know what kind of life form it intends to operate in service of. Who's the principal being served? Who is the agent providing the service? Are citizens property of a monarch? Or are individuals sovereign ends in themselves? Are they equal citizens? What privileges and rights duties would be implied by that? When are citizens analogous to customers? When are citizens analogous to employees? And I suppose some of these are questions for a university too. What's self-governance for a university? Some of a university's officers decide what its objective is, and then they or other officers govern with that objective in mind, at least to pay lip service to it. So how does a university propose to be of service? What principle is a university an agent of? Well, first answer is a university's students are its customers, and providing students with a teaching faculty is a university's main way of being of service. Behind the scenes, there will be research and development, but on this model, the ultimate objective of research is to ramp up the quality of service provided to students by exposing students to a cutting edge of new knowledge. There's a tension here. Insofar as our client is a student, the fact that we serve students as teachers entails duties not only to what our students are, but also to what they can become. And of course, it's imperative to make our students physically safe on campus, but if we assure them, even by accident, that they don't need to grow and grow up. We're failing them. The failure may not show up on their transcript, but it will come back to haunt them. In passing, I have a story about the subtleties of safe space. I had a student at Yale who wrote an editorial that said, paraphrasing for the student newspaper, Yale women are getting invited to parties and being handed drinks from men who've spiked their drinks with sedatives, and then when they pass out, they get raped. We need courts and police to protect us. But the first line of defense has to be ourselves. We have to protect ourselves. So if you go to a party and someone hands you a drink that could have been spiked, don't drink it. 3 decades later, that editorial student newspaper, was excavated and treated as a reason not to confirm her as Brett Kavanaugh's replacement on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. So back when she was a student, she thought she was safe in her dorm room writing an editorial for the freaking student newspaper. Decades later, it turns out she wasn't safe at all. There's a lesson. If students can't say something that may seem immature in retrospect, may seem insensitive by the standards that will be the standards of a future generation, but at the moment just seems like helpful common sense, then we're making it unsafe for them to experiment with thinking for themselves. So we can make campuses safe, but making her safe from the temptation to think for herself, we would be playing God if we tried to do that. We can't do that. We can't do it, and we have no right even to try. We have to teach students that the adults they are becoming can get hurt by the words and deeds of the students that they presently are. The world isn't safe. It just isn't. And we have a duty not to misrepresent that world as safer than it is. And yet even so, you can't live in fear. Students can't live in fear of what they might say or what other people might say. Anyway, at some point we have to put that answer in the context of a second answer, which is a university is a community within a community, and that larger community is the university's ultimate customer. Universities provide communities with an expanding base of knowledge and with a population of graduates trained to run with that knowledge. I suppose a community would want its university to be a place that not only trains but inspires. We do research partly with a view to inspiring students to want to be researchers themselves. And we also teach with a view inspiring students to want, at least in a way, to be teachers. Not necessarily for a living, but simply by being people whom others will have something to learn from as they practice skills that make them worth listening to. Third answer. The client a university serves is the truth itself, knowledge for its own sake. Now, if we care about the idea of a university at all, we want the university to be noble enough for this answer to have some plausibility. And of course, it isn't good enough to defend what one does as pure research. There are an infinite number of truths. Some are worth knowing, but only some of them are worth time and money. So we need criteria of relevance, presumably some version of the communitarian answer that can sort out which truths are worth knowing, worth spending a career chasing after. And still, we want to have enough faith in the truth to want to get to truth, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's in some way disappointing or whatever, shocking. So perhaps a university is an agent of the truth. Most of us, at least, hope to work in service of the truth. But I don't see the truth as a customer or as a consumer of our product. We have some kind of duty to be agents of the truth, but that isn't a duty to a principle. The truth is our product, not our principle. So while truth is pivotal, we still need to identify a principle in service to whom we aim to provide truth. Fourth answer, you could say a university's client is its faculty. A university is, in some respects, a club. Suppose it's a club of truth seekers, and faculty are the club's members. And it's easy to imagine an actual club coming together for that purpose. Imagine the Royal Society of London forming in the late 1600s. Okay. I would say faculty are supposed to be, more than anyone, providers rather than consumers of a university's product. So, the Royal Society is legitimate. Faculty clubs in general presumably are legitimate. But this isn't how universities represent themselves, not how a university wants to be perceived. So even granting some merit in treating spectacular visionaries as principles whose fruitfulness justifies what universities do as their agents, a university can't be justified as a means of empowering pedestrian faculty to be pedestrian. So far as I can see, that takes us back to the first two answers, which are concerned with taking our principle to be our students and our broader community. When talking about how a mission is supposed to provide a framework of criteria for effective university governance, I don't suppose we're in a realm of theorems or proofs or even well-defined questions. It's one of the things that was wrong about 20th century philosophy. I am deeply honored by Jacob's introduction. It's one of the nicest introductions I've ever received, but I'm just aware that it was true, but one of the truths was that I am a leading light of my generation, but that was 20th century. Like, damn, wrong century. But there you go. But again, a purpose is a compass. Your mission should help you evaluate new information as it comes in. Your mission can tell you that the new information is relevant. That's not just truth for its own sake. That's not truth. That's relevant truth. And indeed, the new information supports changing your plan. But you need to know what to expect. And that's why you need a mission, partly. You need a mission statement. You need to know what to expect because you need to know when to count new information as surprising. It's to say, I had a prediction. I had a good reason for predicting that it would turn out like this. It did not turn out like this at all. That's interesting. That tells me I'm on a frontier. I didn't expect to be here, but the world is teaching me something. But it's because I had a hypothesis and I had enough faith, I guess, in my hypothesis to let it be truth sensitive, to let it be falsifiable, to let it be testable. A lot of the 20th century of philosophy was about finding the proposition or the definition that had no counterexamples. There was no possible world in which what I'm saying could be false. You can't even imagine a world in which what I said would be false. We missed a boat there. Our courage failed us. So we need the courage to say things that you can't prove. Yet, like evidence is everywhere, proof is really rare. We needed to be responsive to evidence. And the social sciences sailed off and became their own silos. Philosophy was left to analyze the meanings of terms. And even that we couldn't do. So there you go. So what goes wrong? I'd say a mission statement initially will be a compromise among original framers of that institution's mission statement. Consensus building among framers who result diverse constituencies is an ideal of a kind, but consensus building results in platitudes designed to be innocuous and therefore unobjectionable. I mean, there was a reason why the U.S. founding documents didn't even entail the wrongness of slavery, because there weren't going to be founding documents if they didn't have states like Georgia being part of the Union. So they had to be that platitudinous that they couldn't even rule out slavery. Most of them knew that was wrong, but it's either that or get run over by the British. So that's what they did. So that's the hell of mission statements, and it's the hell of needing to craft them, needing to please, placate, or at least not violate diverse constituencies. So it's an ideal of a kind, but it results in platitudes. I don't know what alternative process would culminate in a decisive mission statement that truly specifies a concrete mission, a concrete commitment, and a way forward. Successive generations of administrators are going to represent diverse constituencies anyway, so there is something to be said for having a founding mission with enough plasticity that future generations can make it work for them. So the founders thought, yeah, they'll be held to pay for this, for agreeing to these innocuous, platitudinous founding statements, and there's going to be a war, but we can't win it today. Maybe in a few decades we can win it. So they punted, and they knew that they were doing something horrible, but I think they thought that it was their best alternative. So in passing, note that a university's mission and its underlying purposiveness will need to be defined. To borrow some accounting terminology, it needs to be defined as a flow, not a stock. A university ideally would endure as an entity with a mission, and a university's very purposiveness is part of how it delivers on its mission. So the purpose isn't to put a lander on Mars or to push the frontier of this cure for this form of breast cancer, so much as to be a crucible from which outcomes like that are an ongoing flow. And the purpose we found yesterday may or may not be our purpose tomorrow. It may not be what can sustain us tomorrow. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to give this lecture, but the way in which it serves my purposes today to be here, that's not a truth about the arc of my whole life. It's today. It's today's purpose, and it makes life meaningful today. But it can't continue to be my purpose. So if I were like groomed to be an Olympic athlete or something like that, if my life's purpose was to compete for this medal on this day, then when the day is over, I'm lost. Unless I can reinvent my purpose, unless I can recover that basic capacity for purposiveness. A concrete purpose, that's ephemeral. A steady flow of abiding purposiveness, that's at the heart of our humanity and at the heart of a healthy self-governance. We succeed as social animals by specializing. Our goals aren't hardwired. But the propensity to develop goals is. We find ways to be of service and thereby build estimable places for ourselves in a community. What nature selects for isn't any specialized skill set, but a capacity to serially specialize. And you need to know that. You will probably have several careers going forward. A community's need to develop reservoirs of capacity is at the heart of a university's mission, and thus needs to be a focus of a university's governance structures. We're capable of shaping ourselves into buggy whip manufacturers. And that capacity survives as a feature of a genotype that doesn't code for buggy whip maker as a specific phenotype. What it codes for is an underlying plastic capacity to take the shape that our community needs us to take in our particular time and place. So we're social beings. We're self-interested, but we aren't hermits. And footnote, economics and philosophy to some extent, it says, okay, there's self-interest, there's the common good, and these are not the same thing. So far, so good. How do we close the gap between them? Well, in economics, we take the self-interest as a given, and in fact, we do something worse than take it as given. We say the self-interest, we're going to operationally define that as an interest in maximizing profit. Why? Because it's true? Because it's like realistic? No, because you can crank out theorems. Once that's what your individual agents are characterized as. You can crank out theorems. And for 150 years now, that's been the project of neoclassical economics, crank out theorems. Kind of a mistake. I mean, not that the theorems aren't interesting. They are. And they are illuminating, too, in a way. But they're not philosophically useful. So we can say individuals are self-interested, but they're not hermits. Their interest isn't something that has this shape, and then you wonder, is there any way that's going to connect to the common good or group interest or the community interest? No, we're social animals. The self that we're interested in is a self that reaches its fruition by establishing an estimable place for itself in a community. The self reaches its fruition by saying, I'm going to provide a service. And I'm going to provide a service at the level of quality such that people come to me and they say, thank you, I'm glad you're here, because I really would have had a problem if you hadn't bailed me out, if you hadn't been able to help. I will tell all my friends that you're the person to go to. I will tell them, I came to you. That was not a case of mistaken identity. I thought you were really good, and you were really good. So that's what our self is fundamentally about. So can that come apart from the common good? Absolutely. But it's not preordained. Okay? Our self can achieve a coming together of those things. And it's an achievement. It's not a given, but it's an achievement that's possible to have there be no conflict between these things. So we're not hermits. The currency of our life's meaning is denominated in what our life means to other people. Capacities that endure can express phenotypically in multiple skill sets, but a lot of them are like occupations: porter, cellist, key punch operator, or whatever the circumstances call for. Otherwise, the next big change will be an extinction event. In a rapidly changing world, any hardwired purpose would be an overspecialization that would be just around the corner from an existentialist crisis. Universities have to be maintaining reservoirs of plasticity rather than producing fine-grained tokens of adaptation. Specialization is good, but the academy needs a better sense of what to count as over-specialization. So imagine, one department studies what spurs productivity, and maybe they're in the College of Business. Another department, maybe it's in the College of Humanities, studies how to distribute the fruits of productivity, and they never talk to each other. If they have faculty clubs, they have separate faculty clubs, like they don't talk. That would be like thinking the key to future progress. Adam Smith taught us, he was right, specialization is shockingly liberating. He says, like, when we specialize, we can be 4,318 times more productive than we would be working on our own. Incredible understatement, right? You can get to a point where you can put 1% of your population to work in the agriculture sector, and instead of starving, your biggest problem is overproduction. So incredible, and that's not even the area where humanity has become especially productive, and still. Still, that's only hundreds of times more productive than they used to be. But in many areas where, even putting a number on it doesn't make sense compared to what we can do. What we can do now compared to what we could have done a century or 2 centuries ago. So universities have to be maintaining reservoirs of plasticity. So what we've got is, it's like these separate departments. It's as if inferring that, well, specialization is so great, I'm going to even take specialization to the next level, and I'm not I can see, well, first there were basket masters, that was a revelation. Then there was Adidas, that was a revelation. And then Nike, that was another revelation. I'm going to specialize in making shoes for the left foot. You know that's a joke, right? Now, a business like that wouldn't have customers, and that would pretty much immediately prove that it was over-specialized. Is it similarly obvious what to count as over-specialization in the academy? Well, what if feedback in the academy, when you send your article to a journal, it consists of getting feedback from 2 referees, experts, selected from the Left Foot Cobblers Club? They need your paper to be published, lest their topic go extinct. So they give it a thumbs up precisely because there's no demand for it. But that kind of feedback won't shut you down for being over-specialized. Our review process fails to tell us how big the market is for insight on any given topic. That's not what refereeing does. Referees don't say thousands of people will want to read that. That is not how it works. They say, this article only quoted me 4 times. It's uneducated. So over-specialization of our reviewers desensitizes us to pointlessness. It desensitizes us to conversations that are turning into echo chambers. So what would it be like to avoid painting ourselves into corners of academic over-specialization? Does anyone focus on questions like these when they talk about mission-driven governance? I don't know, and maybe I'm just missing it, but I don't know. I think it's not high-mindedness, but it's just simple pragmatic realism to say that a university's mission is to be something other than a vocational school that teaches task-specific skill sets. Obviously, some institution has to code for specific vocations, but it's part of a university's point is that the usefulness of task-specific skill sets tends to have an expiry date. Enduring usefulness implies a capacity to acquire whatever new task-specific skill set will be called for by a new situation that's just around the corner. To be wired to find a specialty is to be wired to be creative. Now, what we see in the academy is creativity at the margin, and I don't actually mean that as a complaint. I'm not sure what the alternative would be anyway. It's just an observation about what normal progress is like. And sometimes we even talk about normal progress. Faculty and students aspire to be a little bit different from the people around us. We want the people around us to see our departure as indicating creative flair. They will celebrate our departure if it complements what they brought to the table, but not if our departure makes what they brought obsolete. Being humanly creative in the way that universities encourage is all about making room for ourselves to fit in. Creativity is perceived and appreciated at the margin. It's measured in terms of next steps, not quantum leaps. So to state the obvious, there's a downside to the respect we need to show for what's already on the table. We're wired to trust people. We're wired to trust that previous generation. We assume that walking in their students is worthwhile. It's part of being a social animal. We join the club partly by pretty much believing what people say. We presume people can make up their own minds, and that doing so is an excellence on their part. But that's why it's so terrifying when scholarship becomes a team sport. When people start choosing sides and wearing team colors and booing for the other team, that's when the academy stops being a noble place, when a belief becomes an initiation into membership in a tribe, the academy begins to rot. We do need to censor ourselves, because having a point is about seeing what needs saying. It's not blurting out truth like someone with Tourette's syndrome. The project of pursuing truth has to respond to the human condition in dignified, diplomatic, sensitive, and constructive ways. But it does matter that we're wired to be tribal. If your diversity statement is identical to everyone else's, then no matter what it literally says, it does not express a commitment to diversity. What it manifests is tribalism. So after all the mission stating is done, questions inevitably remain about which way the wind is blowing and what would make it reasonable to expect administrators to know when to resist. So universities have become places where the truth isn't so much pursued as terrorized. When we evolved flexible capacities to answer questions and to fit in, a capacity to wonder what's the point came with the territory. We evolved into creatures with massive abilities to process, evaluate, and adjust to incoming information. We don't always have time to think, but if and when we do have time to wonder what's the point, that's when we start needing answers. So when this life is done, what will be the point of having lived it? Will you know what you stood for, what you fought for? Dwelling on questions like that tends to precipitate existentialist crises. So not all capacities are pro-survival. And this capacity to look in the mirror and say, what's the point? That's not pro-survival. It's a capacity that evolved as part of a package deal. And the package is pro-survival. We have a capacity for self-doubt. It comes with the territory of pro-survival flexibility. It comes with the territory of our pro-survival creativity. It's not a mistake for a university to nurture it. Part of a university's purpose is to help young people know they aren't alone in wondering why they're here. Sometimes wisdom can be articulated. Sometimes it can be shared. We have made mistakes in how we teach ethics. Ironically, the fact that we're inept at teaching ethics seems to be fueling a sense that universities should be doing more to teach ethics. Philosophy has gone through a period of teaching that moral theory is a search for, in effect, a recipe. You know, what's the jingle? What's the code? I follow the code and I'm good to go. And there's not going to be any litigation or anything. I'm good to go if I follow the code. Today's moral theories are jingles, slogans, like boil it down. Give me one word. Is it universalizability or is it utility? What's the one word? And you say, no. Being moral is not about thinking. It all boils down to one word. It's just, that human morality, it just isn't like that. So theories seem designed to tell us what to do, act so that, and they're useless for that purpose. Theorists, hardly anyone you know or ever will know, even professional philosophers, has ever actually used an ethical theory to make a decision. What are philosophers supposed to do when recruited to teach applied ethics classes like business ethics? Administrators who hire them have a vague, I don't criticize the administrators for having the hope, but they hope students should learn to see the ethical dimensions of business decisions. But philosophers weren't taught anything about that, and they know it. So they deflect and redirect the conversation back to familiar turf. They develop case studies, often imaginary, often involving trolleys, so that it's important to the stories that they can't be fact-checked. So when the students say, but you can yell out a warning, you can deflect you can derail the trolley. Can you get back to what's really important here? What's really important here is which number is bigger, 1 or 5, right? That's what it's all about. And you say, no, I don't think so. So they develop these case studies that can't be fact-checked, and they test students with exam questions like, what does the utilitarian say here? A teacher ends up asking students to show proficiency in using a technical term. Not good enough. Questions about how to understand a toy theory, not good enough. We also teach that the true theory would enable you to be certain, and we need to teach that life isn't like that. There's no map and no moral code that relieves you of responsibility for making the call and living with the consequences. Some codes encode wisdom, but there's no such thing as a code you simply follow. Even the best map's point is to provide some guidance for grown-up users and interpreters. So, part of adult responsibility is making choices for reasons that just aren't compelling and not pretending otherwise. Our characteristically human purpose, like I said, is to invent a purpose. To invent a purpose that feels so right that it feels like discovering a purpose. Sometimes a goal feels right. Sometimes it takes work. You have to grow into the choice you made, or you choose a path that really doesn't fit, never will, and you make matters worse by hiding the mistake. You say, yeah, I went down the wrong path here and I know it, but I just can't change my path now. A more generic mistake implicit in our system of education is that we accidentally teach students to treat our courses as games where the way to win is to read the instructor's mind and say whatever the instructor wants to hear. You say what the instructor wants to hear, the instructor says, wow, what an original person. Yeah. So, but learning to say whatever a teacher gives points for, that doesn't prepare a student to live a life. And above all, it doesn't prepare a student for those moments where they make the ethical decisions that will define them. If I could ask universities to teach students one thing, I'd ask it to teach that. And if it succeeded, I'd feel like the university was what the world needed it to be. The lesson is a life is, it's a novel, but you only get to write one. There are better and worse ways of turning out to be only human. You can't be the person who never makes mistakes. But you can be the person who honestly admits them, corrects them as best you can, and gets up tomorrow morning ready to give life another shot. Heroes don't live forever, but neither do cowards. So life will be over someday. And if you get time to reflect, you already know what your final question will be. Was yours a story about a life worth living? Thank you.
In a moment, I'll ask one of the current RGCS Charles Taylor Student Fellows to ask the first question. The first question at these events is always reserved for a member of the Taylor Fellowship. Given that we have a delightful number of alumni in the audience tonight, I will re-emphasize that the first question goes to a current student. But while the current students think about their first question, I'm going to do something that I sometimes do, especially for the people who are going to be watching this on YouTube later on, and provide some footnotes, because Professor Schmitz's lecture, in terms of the arc of his career that I described in my introduction at the beginning, is a return to themes and questions that preoccupied him in Rational Choice and Moral Agency at the beginning of his career, about what it's like to make decisions and what the limits are of what we are rationally compelled to do, and when it is we are doing things for reasons that go beyond what either morality or rationality might demand. But it's returned to those themes in light of what I take to be the methodological shift that characterized both Elements of Justice with its pluralism and attention to the variety of purposes that moral theory has, and in particular the methodological shift that characterizes Living Together, in which he asks questions about the purposes of social theory and what kinds of problems we need to solve when we organize, associate, and live together. And so those looking for some of the sources and roots of everything that we've just heard, I'll point back to those earlier books. And at this point, I will invite a member of the Charles Taylor Student Fellowship to ask the first question. Bria.
Is this already on?
Yes.
Okay. So I guess you talked a lot about like the hyper abstraction of ethical theory, which I agree has gone to absurd lengths, at least at this point. I'm just wondering what you make of, I guess, the moral claims and almost like everyday moral theorizing that we do with each other, where, you know, if my sister steals my sweater and I get mad at her and I say, no, that's wrong, you know, like, I guess, you know, do these hold a similar, I guess, fate with what's the point? Like, do you think we're making any real claim there, or is it doomed to eventual hyper abstraction just as academic ethical theory has kind of become?
Bria?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. I don't really have an answer for you, but I can say I said something quick in passing that moral theory has been it's a quest for proof, and proof is rare. It's deducing things from axioms. Being able to do that is it's a rare thing that you can do that. Whereas evidence is everywhere. We live our lives in an ocean of evidence. And so David Hume was a famous skeptic. He said, hey, have you ever noticed you've never seen a cause? You see one thing happen, you see another thing happen, one thing happened, another thing happened, and then you say, gee, I think A is causing B. But that's an inference. That's leaping to a conclusion. You never actually see causation. And well, philosophers said, oh, wow, he is this incredibly brilliant, flame-throwing skeptic. He proved that we don't even know that there's such a thing as causation. Wasn't his point at all. He was expressing skepticism about deduction, not about causation. He was trying to make ethics more scientific. And part of what he was trying to do in service of making ethics, moral science, more scientific was he was trying to break the tether to the Cartesian approach, which is to say, if it's not indubitably certain, then it's worthless. Yeah, but that's not a foundation for science. Science is about things that aren't certain. Science is about saying, well, I keep seeing this correlation, and I understand that correlation isn't causation, but I'm just going to go ahead and say, yeah, I think A is causing B. And I could turn out to be wrong. It's unscientific to say, I'm certain. But it's totally scientific to say, I'm pretty confident and I could be wrong. But I'm saying, hey, you ate the mushrooms, you got sick. One time, you try it one time, one trial. You don't have to repeat it 10 times. One time you eat those mushrooms, you get sick, and you say, I think I don't like mushrooms very much. Or there's is and ought as well. Like we say this is this, this is this, this is this, and then we start shading into, so I guess we ought to do this. It's like, and so Hume says, you notice that we never have any basis for drawing conclusions about what we ought to do just from observation. That's skepticism about deduction, right? So if your kid puts her hand on the stove, says, oh, pretty, hand on stove, and you say, like, if you're watching that, you're thinking, kid, you ought to move your hand. And you're not wrong. It's an invalid inference, but validity is overrated, right? It's it's just true that she ought to move her hand. And you have plenty of, you have no proof, but you have plenty of evidence. And that's the way to being scientific, is to go with the evidence and to realize you were never really after proof anyway, not in the geometry, logic sense of proof. So I guess that's, I got started in approaching your question anyway. So just to wrap it up, I would say that our theorizing has been about proof, not about evidence so much. It could be about evidence. You could say, look at the, and that's what Adam Smith did. You could read Adam Smith and have no idea that he was a philosopher, because what he was doing was so different from what we do today. But he was a chair of moral philosophy. And what he did as a chair of moral philosophy is he said things like, yeah, I've seen, tariffs go up and down. I've seen when tariffs go up, I've seen, the impact on employment seems to be like this. The impact on the availability of goods and services is like this. It's like our access to French champagne is like this. We end up drinking beer. How does that work exactly? Well, and he doesn't say, therefore, tariffs are wrong. He just says, in effect, I hope to God nobody ever interprets me as having been a defender of tariffs, because they hurt people. Right? Like, tariffs is like putting a kid's hand on the oven. Like, you ought not to do that. But he's not claiming to have a proof. And he was David Hume's best student. David Hume, by the end of his career, Hume was honestly starting to understand, I think, what his own theory was, and Adam Smith was understanding it as well. And they were, the subtitle of Hume's treatise was being an attempt to apply experimental methods of reasoning to moral subjects, something like this. So he was inventing moral science, but he published that in his 20s. I don't think he knew what he was saying in his 20s exactly, but by the end of his life, he did. By the end of his life, if you'd said, so your theory is basically correlation is not causation. It's just evidence. And I think at the end of his life, Hume would have said, bingo, yes. And I think Adam Smith got it too. Adam Smith said it, I'm not after the proof that tariffs are wrong. I'm after the evidence that they hurt people, and you make the call. So I think where we could go, I do think there's room for theorizing. I do think there's room to understand why common sense works this way, and understand how common sense could turn out to be wrong. Understand how we could change our minds about what we count as common sense, but also understand that our intuitions are tracking evidence, and so are not to be trusted 100%, but are not to be disregarded either. So yeah, reason from the if I'm trying to teach people how to theorize today, I'd say start with cases. Don't say we need a theory about what ideal justice is, and then we need to figure out how to handle all the incredible problems. Theorizing that way is, how it's making it impossible for us to live together. So, yeah, start from the bottom up. Reason up from cases to explanations.
Hi, I just have probably not a quick question, but there's so I was just wondering if, one of the things you said that between proof and evidence in the academy, we're seeking for proof while we only have evidence. And most of the time, sort of proof, I'm thinking about law and criminal courts here and the scope of decision that you have. And given that we can never reach proof, what does that have? What implication does it have for afterwards responsibility? Because there are decisions that they're important decisions. For example, if you eat mushrooms and you're just slightly allergic to it, you can eat another day and then you can deduct sort of like the sort of result of it. But there are people who make decisions that kill a lot of people. And slavery is a case, sort of indigenous genocide is a case. And I don't know, at least I feel it's a little bit hard to define responsibility if proof is not something we can reach, at least, if that makes sense.
Yeah. What was your name?
Thu.
Sue?
Thu. Thu.
Thu. Okay. Thank you. I would say a couple of things. First of all, there are sort of analogs of false negatives and false positives. So you could say, if you say as a principle of precaution, I don't want to approve of marketing this drug. It appears to have a therapeutic effect, but it appears to have side effects as well. And so it's part of, if you're a member of a regulatory agency, that's hell. And it's not your fault, right? You could say, if I approve this, a bunch of people could get killed. And if I don't approve this, I won't be blamed for it, but it's still kind of my fault if a whole bunch of people die because they didn't have access to the treatment. So I might say, yeah, best to err on the conservative side and not approve things until I'm really sure that I won't get blamed for having approved them. And so we may be, it's natural for us to be a bit more conservative than we should be, but still there is a reason to be conservative. I mean, that's a Hippocratic oath, right? Above all, do thy patient no harm. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so there's that idea. I would also say that you ended up there, I think, but what you started reminded me of something else, which is to say, sometimes you figure things out after the fact. Sometimes there is no truth of the matter. You said you referred to the law. And I think, so we think of, morality is this really fundamental thing. And politics is this thing that comes along later. It's a precipitate of ethics. It's derivative from ethics. And law is even more derivative than that. And I no longer think that. I think that if I'm thinking about ethics, I'm thinking about something that is supposed to be about how social animals should live a life. And I'm thinking that's political right out of the gate. It's to say, how do I represent myself to other people? How far do I go to convince other people that I'm trustworthy? How far do I go in negotiating sustainable terms of engagement between myself and a business partner? So I say, no, that price just doesn't work for me. You're going to have to do better. You don't want to do better? Okay, that's fine. It's your life. I'll see it tomorrow. Maybe you'll change your mind. But so negotiation is, and alertness to how to be of service, to say, you need me. Come on. You got to, whatever it is that's preventing you from turning to me and asking me for help, you need to get over that, because I can help you and I want to help you, but I'm not going to be able to help you if you don't realize that you need my help and ask for it. So I can't like chase the back of your head. So it's like that. But law, sometimes law can actually determine right and wrong morally. We have all kinds of, we're territorial, right? And any animal capable of locomotion is territorial, has a sense of trespassing, has a sense of not wanting other animals to just wander around on its turf. And so territoriality didn't emerge with humanity. It emerged like with the animal kingdom, I think. But still, you don't know where the edges are. And there's always something new coming up, right? So you say, okay, I'm trying to start up a business here. Maybe I'm trying to collect ducks to provide my community with protein, or maybe I'm trying to start up a preschool or something like that. My neighbor keeps like firing a musket into the air and either scaring away the ducks or scaring away my kids, right? And so you go to a judge, and you ask a judge, right or wrong, in or out, like illegal, not illegal, like I want you to protect me from my neighbor. And my neighbor is doing it to disrupt me. So the judge says to the neighbor, you have a right to do whatever you want on your own property, but the assumption is when you do whatever you want on your own property, you're minding your own business. The point isn't to make it impossible for your neighbors to mind their business. Right? So I say, hey, it's my garage. I can build biological weapons in my garage if I want. No, you can't. You just can't. It's against the law. And I mean, that would have been wrong anyway. But people decide what's wrong. You could say, okay, who would have known? In Roman times, they didn't see this coming, but somebody would invent airplanes someday, and that plane just flew over my land at 10,000 feet. And I'm taking them to court for trespassing. So is flying over somebody's land at 10,000 feet, is it trespassing? And in 1936, there was no truth of the matter. There was no yes, there was no no. And the plaintiff said, yeah, this is kind of an ancient Roman principle. He who owns the land owns it to the skies. So yeah, it's trespassing. And the judge says, whoa. This could go very badly. I can't just say never. I mean, and he kind of did say, "Yeah, never mind." Right? 2,000 years, they were savages. Never mind. Forget it. Ignore them. I'm just saying it's legal to fly over land at 10,000 feet. But that turned out to. I mean, the judge didn't even understand. But the judge actually made the right decision, and the right decision was your property lines are meant to secure your ability to grow a crop on your land and then take it to market and sell it at a mutually agreeable price and a sustainable price, right? If you're generating cash flows that enables you to buy more seed, it's all good. So you do that. You have to make enough money to plant another crop. But does it also involve? Does your right to say no trespassing give you a right to prevent other people from minding their own business? That thing, Pacific Air Transport, that just flew over, someday they would change their name to United Airlines. They had reduced the time that it took to get a piece of mail from New York to LA. They'd reduced it from 6 weeks to 6 hours. And so the judge said, no way am I going to make that illegal. So anyway, your right to put up a no trespassing sign is a right to prevent other people from interfering with your business. It's not a right to prevent other people from minding their business and figuring out ways to increase their value to their community. So you can make sense of that. Like somebody like me, I can come along and say, oh man, give me that. I'm going to do some theorizing. I'm going to get some articles. I'm going to push my career to the next stage. But I'm doing ethics. Partly what enables me to do ethics and to make progress doing ethics is realizing that ethics isn't what comes first. Right? It's the cases that come first. It's the law that comes first. It's the realities of politics that come first. And what counts as ideal has to be an ideal response to those realities.
All right, I hope we will get through Maddie, Blaze, and Rajesh, but we're not going to get any further than that, so my apologies to other people who have their hands up.
So I'm going to shorten my answers. I'm just going to go yes, no.
Maddie.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for the talk. I first want to say I enjoyed
your discussion of sort of the futile image of having the moral philosopher go and visit a business class and teach teach ethics to business students and completely miss the point in a sense. But I want to ask a question about, to me, like as a student at McGill, it seems that what's partly enjoyable, not a business student of course, but what's enjoyable about learning ethics and learning moral philosophy in class is this sort of meta project of the professor in maybe like engaging the affects when you're discussing someone like Kant, for example, asking people to treat other people as means and not ends, and the sort of effective response that's brought about in those circumstances. And I'm wondering, what your response might be to the sort of ethics professor that says, well, there is a position for moral philosophy in something like business ethics for that particular reason, like the effective role of engaging, or like the consequence of engaging people's emotions in the project or questions of moral philosophy, and how that might be relevant for something like business. Thank you.
That's funny that you would describe that as an emotional issue. Remind me, what's your name again? Maddie, okay. Maddie, sometimes I cross a line and say things that make me a threat. And it's not a good career move to become a threat. So I don't aspire to do that. That's not my ambition. My ambition is to see what will be perceived as a contribution at the margin. And I haven't always succeeded at that. That's life. But just quickly, if somebody says, yeah, it's about the principle of utility, it's about the greatest happiness for the greatest number, and I'll say, and then Mill will say, so you see, Kant was basically a utilitarian. It's like, come on. But I will say, anybody who says you ought to do the best you can. So that's the common sense intuition that makes utilitarianism a compelling philosophy. It's the intuition, that common sense, that's right. The thing that's wrong, like the content of that is not wrong. It's trying to turn that into a recipe. That's what's wrong. So I would say, hey, I got your intuition. I'm not with you like 60%. I'm with you 100%. Just, you snatch defeat from the jaws of victory when you turn that into a recipe. Somebody who says, what if other people did that? What if everybody did that? I would say that's not deontology, but that's an intuition underlying deontology, and somehow it is totally appropriate as a nugget of common sense to say, if you'd be ashamed at other people seeing what you were doing and knowing why you were doing it, that's a pretty good reason not to do it. Not decisive. It's not a good recipe. But I do think it's a profound truth. But just if you leave the recipes out of it, you're really saying something profoundly important. So that's what I would say about that. And what I would say to business students is to say, you want the code that will make you blameless. You want the code that will bulletproof you from litigation or something like that. Life just isn't like that. So I say, the decision won't be made by your code or your theory. The decision will be made by you. You will be responsible for the decisions you make. So you better think hard and take these nuggets of common sense wisdom into account. But people say, what would Jesus do? Or what would the wise man do, or wise person do? I think that's another nugget of common sense wisdom, but it doesn't It's not a way of avoiding responsibility. There is no way of avoiding responsibility.
So it strikes me, this is sort of kind of asking to apply your theory to some other kind of modern variants of philosophy and economics, actually. So in the past 5 or 10 years, there's been a growth in areas of study in philosophy, politics, and economics oriented towards kind of assessing the long-term future of humanity, or varyingly how to ensure continued technological progress. So I'm thinking primarily of several kind of clusters: long-termism, people like Will MacAskill, existential risk, people like Nick Bostrom, then progress studies, which is more oriented towards assessing. Tyler Cowen coined the term, and it's oriented towards assessing how to best bring about economic progress.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask what kind of bearing your approach to ethics would have on those fields. I can already think that you may not be positive on long-termism, because one of the major flaws is, that it emphasizes of one end, the survival of the species, over any kind of other smaller contingent ends. But it seems like progress studies could be an interesting area, basically asking how to generate the kind of set of social purposes and ends that leads to social progress. And the second point is, do you think, the people involved in all these fields I named were either economists or philosophers? None of them were theorists. Do you think that's kind of a lacuna for theory, really addressing these kinds of, I'll say, like futuristic areas of thought?
So what was your name?
Blaise.
Blaise?
Yeah.
Okay. How do you spell that?
Blaise, just like Blaise Pascal.
Yeah. Cool. You're the first Blaise I've met. So just a couple of quick things. I know we're kind of out of time, but about existential risk. So I'm talking about tracking progress, seeing progress, and seeing, like, we can see that we're on a gradient. And so we think, okay, well, if we're on a hillside, there has to be a peak. No, there does not have to be a peak. We make up the concept of a peak in this as part of this metaphor. We don't make up the idea of being on a grade. We can see progress, but we can't see that progress is going to continue. We can't see that progress isn't going to lead us off a cliff. In fact, anybody who thinks climate change, it's just like, I've got a theory, it can't be so bad. It's like, no, we don't have a theory like that. We don't know. It could be catastrophic, but it is progress that is leading us there. So you might say technology has caused that problem in all kinds of areas, and you might say, yeah, if there's going to be a solution, it's going to be technology. Like you might say, petroleum's had a lot to do with causing the problem, and nuclear power is going to have a lot to do with solving it. And so we're going to have to get over being afraid of it. But it is something to be afraid of in various ways. So yeah, there's no guarantee that what's ahead will be what we're planning it to be. It won't be. It's going to be a surprise. Like AI. Well, like everybody's trying to write a science fiction novel about what can go wrong with it, and you think, I don't know, maybe that could go wrong with it. But it's going. If it takes us off a cliff, it'll do some great things before that happens. So yeah, I don't think we should take any false comfort in that. I think so. We're not just gene pools subject to myopic selection processes. We are that, but we are also things where our selection processes are operating on our plans and intentions and our hopes and our projections. So we aren't blind, but we don't see nearly as much as we think that we see. And that's, you know, wisdom is going to be about grasping the bounds of our knowledge, the bounds of our ability to foretell the future. And so I look up things, like if you say, there's a theory that's gaining some prominence now called limitarianism, like nobody should own, the world doesn't need billionaires. And you say, well, yeah, I kind of get that. But on the other hand, if we said to whatever, if we said to Bill Gates or Stephen Jobs to say, yeah, your stock, you can't own more than $1 billion of stock in the company you started. And then they say, if I sell off like 99% of my stock, do you realize what's going to happen to the stock price? Like, it's that valuable because I own it. And so, like, if you realize, like, you know, the richest people, their wealth isn't sitting in banks. Like, it isn't like piles of $100 bills sitting in banks. It's their wealth consists of the fact that their ideas are what's running a chunk of the economy. So, so part of what I would say as an appeal to realism is, like, I totally understand the limitarian idea. But I think the people who are pushing the limitarian idea, they never talk about not that I've ever seen, about the fact that wealth exists in a certain form, and you can't just move it from one place to another without it becoming something different and maybe not being wealth anymore. So, thanks, Blaise.
You to hold on to these for a moment. Before we thank Professor Schmidtz, we have 3 things that we do at the end of these events. The first, the most fun, is a book giveaway to a student who registered to come, and that is, I have Eva Sandulescu. Okay. Oh, okay. Yes, come on up and get your book. And then we have both immediate term announcements and longer term announcements. For the immediate term, after we thank Professor Schmidtz, we'll adjourn to a reception in the room next door. The people who are going to dinner, we will leave as a group at 6:50. And for everyone else, the rest of the reception will carry on until 7. Looking ahead, there are other events on the RGCS calendar and calendars of some of our partner organizations. One of our partner organizations, the Groupe de Recherche Interuniversitaire en Philosophie Politique, has asked me to remind the PhD fellows that you owe an answer about an upcoming dinner. I think Nicholas, I'm not going to get his name right. Thank you. Please answer that email about the dinners. For RGCS, 2 weeks and a day from today, there will be a day-long manuscript workshop for the book manuscript by our postdoctoral fellow, Will Tillicek, his book manuscript on Foucault. That is open to members of RGCS and GRIP and a couple of other sponsoring organizations. And if you want to take part in that, please register and read the whole book manuscript prior to going and spending the day talking about it. Next semester, there will be 2 events in the RGCS Lecture Series. One lecture by Abigail Eisenberg, political theorist at the University of Victoria, and one by Sean Ingham, a political theorist at the University of California at San Diego. The immediately next event in this series, and one at which I hope to see all of you 2 weeks from today, will be given by Richard Bellamy, political theorist at the University College London. The title of the talk is, I believe, The Rule of Law as the Democratic Rule of Persons. Most of our events are in this room. Professor Bellamy's talk will not be in this room. It will be in Leacock 232. So that's short-term announcements and long-term announcements. And with that, please join me in giving a very warm thanks to Professor David Schmidtz.